and the storm that awaited him was only beginning. Chapter 17. A storm on the horizon. The forest thinned as Torian and Skarn followed the winding path, its edges marked by crumbling stones and roots that twisted like ancient scars. The air was heavy, charged with a subtle energy that made Torian's skin prickle. The warmth of the fire, the grounding of the earth, and the freedom of the wind pulsed steadily within him, a quiet rhythm that guided his steps. But something felt wrong. The light filtering through the trees was dimmer now, the sun obscured by thick clouds that swirled unnaturally overhead. The faint scent of rain lingered in the air, but it wasn't just rain. It carried something sharper, something metallic and electric. "Feels like the calm before the storm," Torian murmured, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. He glanced at Skarn, who walked beside him with its body tense, its golden eyes scanning the shadows. The beast growled low, its ears twitching. Torian tightened his grip on his dagger, the glow from its blade faint but steady. The path ahead curved sharply, disappearing into a dense wall of trees. He hesitated, his heart pounding. "Guess there's no going back," he muttered, stepping forward. The forest opened into a wide expanse, the ground sloping downward into a shallow valley. The grass here was blackened and brittle, as if scorched by lightning, and the air buzzed with an eerie energy. At the center of the valley stood a towering spire of dark stone, its surface slick with rain and etched with glowing runes. Torian froze, his breath catching. The spire pulsed faintly, its light growing brighter with each heartbeat. The energy radiating from it was familiar, too familiar. He glanced at Skarn, who growled softly, its golden eyes fixed on the structure. "This feels wrong," Torian said, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, the fire in his chest flaring faintly in response to the spire's presence. The ground beneath his feet crackled with every step, the brittle grass shattering like glass. The wind picked up suddenly, whipping at his cloak and pulling at his hair. The scent of rain grew stronger, mingling with the sharp tang of ozone. Torian stopped a few paces from the spire, his dagger trembling in his hand. "What is this place?" he murmured. The air shifted, heavy with the promise of violence. From the shadows around the spire, figures emerged. Their forms were twisted and jagged, humanoid but barely recognizable. Their bodies were made of blackened stone, their faces featureless except for glowing eyes that burned with malice. Each step they took sent cracks rippling through the brittle ground. Torian's chest tightened as he raised his dagger. Skarn growled louder, its claws digging into the earth. The figures moved slowly at first, their steps deliberate, but then they surged forward with terrifying speed. "Here we go again," Torian muttered, bracing himself. The first figure lunged, its clawed hand striking like a blade. Torian dodged to the side, the blow slicing through the air where he had stood moments before. He countered with a swift slash of his dagger, the blade glowing brighter as it connected with the figure's chest. The energy surged, fire flaring through the stone, and the figure crumbled into dust. Skarn leapt at the second figure, its roar echoing through the valley. The beast's claws raked through the creature's body, scattering fragments of stone and glowing embers. The figure struck back, but Skarn dodged, its movements quick and fluid. The third figure circled Torian, its glowing eyes narrowing. Torian turned to face it, his breaths coming fast. The energy within him pulsed stronger now, the fire, earth, and wind weaving together into a steady rhythm. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. The figure lunged, but Torian didn't falter. He met the attack head-on, his dagger slicing through the air. The blade connected with the figure's chest, the fire flaring brighter, and the creature dissolved into ash. The valley grew still, the silence almost deafening. Torian lowered his dagger, his chest heaving. Skarn stood nearby, its golden eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "That wasn't so bad," Torian said, though his voice was hoarse. He slipped the dagger into its sheath, his fingers brushing the wolf carving in his pocket. Maybe we're getting better at this. The spire pulsed again, its light flaring brighter. Torian's smile faded as the ground beneath his feet trembled. The brittle grass cracked and splintered, and the wind roared to life, swirling around them in a violent storm. Torian stumbled, his hand going to his dagger as the spire's light consumed the valley. The energy surged, wild and uncontrollable, and he felt the fire, earth, and wind within him flare in response. "What now?" he muttered, his voice lost in the roar of the storm. A figure emerged from the light, its form towering and monstrous. Its body was a shifting mass of stone, fire, and wind, its eyes burning with an intensity that made Torian's chest tighten. It moved with a terrifying grace, each step shaking the ground. Skarn roared, stepping in front of Torian, its body low and ready to strike. Torian raised his dagger, the glow from the blade steady, but faint compared to the energy radiating from the creature. The figure stopped a few paces away, its voice a deep, resonant growl. "You carry the elements, but you are not their master. Show me your strength, or falto their fury." Torian clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the dagger. The fire, earth, and wind within him surged, their energy burning brighter. He took a step forward, his gaze steady despite the fear gnawing at his chest. "Let's do this," he said softly. The creature lunged, its massive form moving with terrifying speed. Torian dodged to the side, his dagger flashing as he struck at its arm. The blade connected, fire flaring through the stone, but the creature barely faltered. It turned, its hand sweeping toward him in a wide arc. Torian raised his free hand, the energy within him surging. The wind responded, a sudden gust pushing him out of the creature's path. He landed in a crouch, his breaths coming fast. Skarn leapt at the creature, its claws tearing into its chest. The beast roared, its movements quick and relentless, but the creature countered, striking Skarn with a blow that sent it tumbling into the dirt. "Skarn!" Torian shouted, his chest tightening. The beast growled, shaking itself off, but its movements were slower now. Torian turned back to the creature, his heart pounding. The elements surged within him, stronger than ever, but they were chaotic, pulling in different directions. He closed his eyes, his breath steadying. "Balance, Torian," a faint voice whispered in his mind. "They are one. So are you." The energy within him shifted, the chaos settling into harmony. The fire burned steady, the earth grounded him, and the wind carried him forward. He opened his eyes, his dagger blazing with light. The creature lunged again, but Torian met the attack head-on. The blade struck true, the energy flaring brightly as it cut through the creature's chest. The light consumed the creature, its form shattering into fragments of fire, stone, and wind. The valley grew silent once more, the storm fading. Torian stood still, his chest heaving, the dagger's glow fading. Skarn limped toward him, its golden eyes steady despite the exhaustion in its movements. Torian knelt beside the beast, resting a hand on its shoulder. "We're okay," he said softly, his voice trembling. "We're okay." The spire dimmed, its light fading into the shadows. Torian stood, his resolve hardening as he looked at the path ahead. The storm had passed, but he knew the greatest trials were still to come. "Let's go," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Skarn fell into step beside him, and together they disappeared into the fading light. Chapter 18. The shattered veil of the path beyond the spire stretched into a vast plain, its horizon shrouded in a haze of mist. The ground beneath Torian's boots was firm but lifeless, a pale, cracked surface that whispered of a land long abandoned. The air carried a faint chill, a sharp contrast to the storm's heat and fury. Skarn padded silently beside him, its golden eyes scanning the mist for signs of movement. The beast's steps were slower now, its injuries from the battle evident in its gait. Torian glanced at his companion, worry flickering in his chest. "You holding up okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Skarn huffed in response, its ears flicking forward. Torian managed a faint smile, his hand brushing the wolf carving in his pocket. Yeah, me too. The mist thickened as they pressed on, the horizon vanishing into a sea of white. Torian's breaths came quicker, the cold air biting at his lungs. Every step felt heavier, the silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. Ahead, the mist began to shift. Shadows moved within it, their forms vague and indistinct. Torian stopped, his hand going to the hilt of his dagger. The blade pulsed faintly, the warmth of the fire stirring in his chest. "What is this place?" he muttered, his voice lost in the stillness. The shadows grew clearer, their outlines taking shape. Torian's chest tightened as he realized what they were. Figures, humanoid but distorted, their limbs elongated and their movements slow and deliberate. Their eyes glowed faintly, twin points of pale light in the mist. One of the figures stepped forward, its voice a low, echoing whisper. "You do not belong here." Torian raised his dagger, its glow cutting through the mist. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "What is this place?" The figure tilted its head, the motion unnervingly slow. "This is a veil, a boundary between what was and what could be." It stepped closer, its glowing eyes fixed on him. "You have crossed into what lies beyond understanding." Torian's grip tightened on the dagger. "I didn't ask for this," he said sharply. "I'm just trying to figure out what's happening to me." The figure paused, its gaze unyielding. "You seek answers, but answers have their price. Are you prepared to pay it?" Before Torian could respond, the mist erupted into motion. The figures surged forward, their movements fluid and unnatural. Skarn roared, leaping into the fray, its claws tearing through the nearest shadowed form. The creature dissolved into mist, but two more replaced it, their glowing eyes burning with cold intensity. Torian lunged, his dagger slicing through the air. The blade connected with one of the figures, the energy within him flaring brightly. The fire surged, consuming the shadow in a burst of light, but the effort left him unsteady. Another figure struck from the side, its clawed hand raking across his arm. He stumbled, the pain sharp and searing. Skarn growled, positioning itself between him and the advancing figures. The beast struck again and again, its movements fierce but deliberate, yet the shadows continued to press forward. The mist thickened, the figures multiplying. Torian's chest heaved as he raised his dagger, the fire, earth, and wind surging within him. He closed his eyes, the voices of the elements whispering in his mind. Together, balance, strength, the energy within him shifted, the fire burning steady, the earth grounding him, and the wind carrying his movements. Torian opened his eyes, his steps lighter now, his dagger glowing brighter. The first shadow lunged, but he dodged easily, his blade slicing through its core. The second struck from behind, but the wind carried him out of its reach. He turned, the fire flaring through his blade as it cut through the shadow. Skarn roared, its claws raking through the remaining figures. The beast's golden eyes burned with determination, its movements quick and relentless. Together, they fought back the shadows, their attacks precise and unyielding. One by one, the figures dissolved into the mist, their glowing eyes fading. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. But the air felt lighter now, the weight of the veil lifting slightly. Torian dropped to his knees, his chest heaving. The dagger slipped from his hand, its glow fading. Skarn limped toward him, its golden eyes steady despite the exhaustion in its movements. "We did it," Torian said softly, his voice trembling. He rested a hand on the beast's shoulder, his fingers brushing its iron-like hide. "We're still standing." The mist began to recede, the shadows dissolving into the pale expanse. Torian stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The fire, earth, and wind pulsed within him, their energy steady and harmonious. As the mist cleared, the landscape shifted. The pale ground gave way to a narrow path, its edges lined with stones that glowed faintly in the dim light. Torian tightened his grip on the wolf carving in his pocket, his resolve hardening. "We keep moving," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Skarn growled softly, falling into step beside him. Together, they stepped onto the path, the veil fading behind them. Chapter 19. The forgotten sanctuary. The narrow path led Torian and Skarn out of the suffocating mist of the veil and into a landscape that felt untouched by time. Massive stone pillars rose from the earth like sentinels, their surfaces covered in intricate carvings that glowed faintly in hues of blue and gold. The air was warmer here, lighter, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and fresh rain. Torian slowed his steps, his eyes scanning the area. The energy within him, the fire, earth, and wind, pulsed gently, as if in harmony with the surroundings. He tightened his grip on the wolf carving in his pocket, the worn edges grounding him. "This place is different," he murmured. His voice felt out of place here, too loud in the serene stillness. Skarn huffed softly, its golden eyes watching the horizon. The beast seemed calm but alert, its body tense, as if sensing something just out of reach. Torian stepped closer to one of the stone pillars, his hand brushing its cool surface. The carvings felt alive beneath his fingers, their faint glow flickering like the rhythm of a heartbeat. "What is this place?" he whispered, more to himself than to Skarn. The path led them deeper into the sanctuary, the towering pillars growing closer together, forming a natural corridor. The carvings on the stones began to shift, their patterns flowing like water. Torian paused, his chest tightening as the symbols morphed into familiar shapes, flames, roots, and swirling winds. "The elements," he said softly, his breath catching. "They're all here." Skarn growled low, drawing his attention. The beast's ears flicked forward, its gaze fixed on the path ahead. Torian followed its line of sight, his pulse quickening. At the end of the corridor stood an archway carved from shimmering stone. Beyond it lay a circular chamber, its floor inlaid with the same glowing symbols as the pillars. In the center of the chamber was a pedestal, its surface etched with runes that pulsed faintly. Torian stepped toward the archway, his heart pounding. The energy within him flared, the fire burning brighter, the earth grounding him more firmly, and the wind stirring against his skin. He hesitated at the threshold, glancing back at Skarn. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his chest. Skarn huffed, stepping forward to stand at his side. Torian took a deep breath and stepped into the chamber. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The warmth of the sanctuary gave way to a strange stillness, the energy in the chamber pressing against him like a physical force. The runes on the floor flared brighter, their glow casting shifting patterns across the walls. The pedestal pulsed with light, its surface flickering like the embers of a dying fire. Torian approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. The energy within him pulsed in time with the light, each beat resonating deep in his chest. When he reached the pedestal, he saw that its surface held a shallow indentation, perfectly shaped to fit the wolf carving in his pocket. He froze, his breath catching. The carving felt heavier now, its edges sharp against his palm. "This has to mean something," he murmured. He glanced at Skarn, who stood silently beside him, its golden eyes fixed on the pedestal. "What do you think?" Skarn growled softly, its gaze steady. Torian nodded, his grip tightening on the carving. "Yeah, I think so too." He placed the carving into the indentation, and the chamber erupted with light. The runes flared, their glow weaving upward in twisting patterns, forming shapes that hovered in the air, a blazing flame, a twisting root in a swirling wind. Torian stumbled back, shielding his eyes as the energy surged around him. The symbols grew brighter, their forms merging into a single, blinding light. When the glow subsided, a figure stood before him. The figure was humanoid but otherworldly, its body composed of flickering energy that shifted between fire, earth, and wind. Its face was featureless, save for eyes that glowed with a steady, golden light. It raised a hand, its voice a deep, resonant hum. Torian, you have come far, but the path ahead is not yet clear. The elements have chosen you, but their unity remains fragile. Torian's chest tightened as he stepped forward, his voice trembling. I've done everything I can. I've faced your trials, balanced the elements. What more do you want from me? The figure's gaze bore into him, unyielding. Balance is not a destination. It is a choice made with every step. The elements have accepted you, but you must prove your resolve. Torian opened his mouth to respond, but the figure raised its hand. The chamber darkened, the light from the runes fading into shadows. The ground beneath Torian shifted, and he stumbled as the chamber transformed. The circular room gave way to an open expanse, its horizon stretching endlessly. The pillars of the sanctuary were gone, replaced by jagged rocks that jutted from the ground like broken bones. The air was heavy with tension, the faint scent of ash and damp earth lingering. Skarn growled, its body low and ready. Torian drew his dagger, the blade glowing faintly in the dim light. The figure's voice echoed around them, disembodied and omnipresent. The elements are yours to wield, but they are also yours to protect. Will you fight for them? Will you fight for yourself? The shadows shifted and 3 forms emerged. Each one embodied an element, fire, earth, and wind, its presence radiating power. Their glowing eyes burned with challenge as they moved toward him. Torian's chest heaved as the energy within him flared. The fire burned bright, the earth steadied him, and the wind carried him forward. He raised his dagger, his gaze steady. I'm ready, he said, his voice firm. The figures lunged and the battle began. Chapter 20. The heart of the elements, the figures moved with terrifying precision, their forms shimmering as they shifted between fire, earth, and wind. Each step they took seemed to pulse in time with the energy coursing through Torian's chest. The battle was not just physical, it was elemental. Skarn growled low, stepping in front of Torian, its claws digging into the ground. The beast's golden eyes burned with determination as it crouched, ready to strike. Torian gripped his dagger tightly, its faint glow steady in the dim light. The first figure, wreathed in fire, lunged forward. Its movements were fluid, the flames licking hungrily at the air as it closed the distance. Torian raised his dagger, the warmth of the fire within him surging to meet the attack. The blade connected, sparks flying as the fire surged around them. The figure recoiled, its flames flaring brighter before extinguishing momentarily. Torian pressed the advantage, his movements deliberate, each strike guided by the steady rhythm of the elements within him. The second figure, its body composed of jagged stone and twisting roots, stepped forward. Its presence was heavy, its movements deliberate and unrelenting. Torian felt the ground tremble beneath him as it raised an arm, the earth itself responding to its command. The roots surged toward him, but Torian moved with purpose, the grounding energy of the earth steadying his steps. He sidestepped the attack, his dagger slicing through the thick vines. The blade pulsed with light, the energy within it severing the roots with ease. Skarn roared, leaping onto the figure's back. Its claws tore through the stone, scattering shards across the battlefield. The figure stumbled, its glowing eyes flickering, but it struck back with a powerful blow that sent Skarn sprawling. Skarn! Torian shouted, his chest tightening. The beast growled, shaking itself off, but its movements were slower now. Torian turned back to the figure, his jaw tightening. The energy within him flared, the fire and earth surging together as he drove his dagger into the figure's chest. The light exploded outward, and the figure crumbled into dust. The final figure, a whirlwind of shifting air, circled Torian with unnerving speed. Its presence was elusive, its form constantly changing, making it impossible to predict its movements. The wind howled, pulling at Torian's cloak and hair, threatening to unbalance him. Torian closed his eyes, the whispers of the wind within him growing louder. He let the energy flow, his body moving with the current rather than against it. The dagger in his hand grew lighter, its glow steady as he stepped into the figure's path. The wind surged around him, but Torian didn't falter. He struck with precision, the blade slicing through the figure's core. The light flared once more, and the figure dissolved into the air, its presence fading like a dying breeze. The battlefield grew silent, the energy settling. Torian dropped to his knees, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. The dagger slipped from his hand, its glow fading. Skarn limped toward him, its golden eyes steady despite the exhaustion in its movements. "We did it," Torian said softly, his voice trembling. He reached out, resting a hand on the beast's shoulder. "We're still here." The ground beneath him shifted, the jagged rocks smoothing as the expanse transformed. The open field gave way to a chamber of light, the glowing runes of the sanctuary returning to life. The pedestal stood at the center, its surface pulsing faintly. Torian stood slowly, his legs unsteady. The energy within him felt different now, stronger, more harmonious. The fire burned steady, the earth grounded him, and the wind moved freely, carrying him forward. The figure of light reappeared, its form flickering as it stepped toward him. Its voice was calm, resonant. "You have proven your resolve. The elements have tested you, and you have endured. But endurance alone is not enough." Torian frowned, his jaw tightening. "What else do you want from me?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I've done everything, faced every trial. What more can I give?" The figure's gaze bore into him, unyielding. "You have united the elements within yourself, but now you must unite them beyond. The balance you carry is fragile. To protect it, you must wield it not as a weapon, but as a bond." Torian's grip on the wolf carving tightened, the words sinking deep. The figure stepped closer, its glowing hand reaching out to touch his chest. The energy within him flared, brighter and more powerful than ever before. The figure's voice softened. "The path ahead will test more than your strength. It will test your heart. Are you ready to face it?" Torian hesitated, his mind racing. He thought of his village, his father's sacrifice, and the weight of the journey that had brought him here. He thought of Skarn, who had fought beside him through every trial. He thought of the fire, earth, and wind, and the fragile balance they had forged together. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever comes next, I'll face it." The figure nodded, its form dissolving into light. The energy within Torian settled, a quiet strength that pulsed steadily. The chamber grew brighter, the light enveloping him and Skarn as the sanctuary faded into nothingness. When the light cleared, they stood at the edge of a vast cliff, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. The air was crisp, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain. The path ahead was uncertain, but Torian's resolve was stronger than ever. He turned to Skarn, his hand brushing the wolf carving in his pocket. "We're not done yet," he said softly. Skarn huffed in agreement, its golden eyes glinting. Together, they stepped forward, the horizon calling them onward. Chapter 21. The path of shadows, the cliff's edge fell away beneath Torian's feet, revealing a valley below shrouded in darkness. The horizon, painted in streaks of gray and deep purple, stretched endlessly, the faint glow of a distant storm casting eerie flickers of light across the landscape. The air was colder here, carrying the faint, metallic tang of something ancient and foreboding. Torian stood still for a moment, his hand gripping the wolf carving in his pocket. The warmth of the fire, the strength of the earth, and the freedom of the wind pulsed steadily within him. But here, the energy felt subdued, as though the land itself were resisting him. Skarn moved beside him, the beast's golden eyes scanning the valley below. Its body was tense, its ears flicking at every faint sound. Torian glanced at his companion, nodding slightly. "Yeah, I feel it too," he murmured. "This place isn't right." The path ahead was narrow and jagged, carved into the side of the cliff. It spiraled downward, disappearing into the shadowy depths. Torian adjusted the strap of his satchel, the weight of his dagger reassuring against his hip. "No point in waiting," he said softly. "Let's go." The descent was slow and treacherous. The path crumbled beneath Torian's boots, the loose gravel skittering down the cliffside. The wind tugged at his cloak, carrying whispers that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. He tightened his grip on the dagger, its faint glow steady in the dim light. As they moved deeper into the valley, the shadows grew thicker, almost tangible. The light from the horizon faded, replaced by a dim, flickering glow that seemed to come from the ground itself. Torian paused, kneeling to inspect the cracks in the earth. Faint streams of dark energy pulsed within them, like veins of a living creature. "What is this?" he muttered, brushing his fingers against the surface. The energy tingled beneath his skin, cold and invasive. He pulled back quickly, shaking off the sensation. Skarn growled softly, its gaze fixed on the darkness ahead. Torian stood, his jaw tightening. "We're not alone." The first sound came from the shadows, a low, guttural growl that echoed through the valley. Torian's chest tightened as he turned, his dagger ready. The growl was followed by another, then another, until the air was filled with the chilling sound. From the darkness emerged creatures unlike anything Torian had faced before. Their forms were twisted and distorted, humanoid but barely recognizable. Their bodies were made of shifting shadows, their eyes glowing with an unnatural red light. They moved with a predatory grace, circling Torian and Skarn like wolves stalking prey. Torian steadied his breathing, the energy within him flaring. The fire burned brighter, the earth steadied his stance, and the wind whispered at his back, guiding his movements. "Stay close," he said to Skarn, his voice low. The first creature lunged, its claws slicing through the air. Torian stepped aside, his dagger flashing as it connected with the creature's chest. The fire surged, consuming the shadow in a burst of light, but the effort left him unsteady. Another creature struck from behind, forcing him to roll to the side. Skarn roared, leaping at the nearest creature. Its claws tore through the shadow's form, scattering it into fragments of darkness. The beast turned quickly, its golden eyes burning with fury as it faced the next attacker. The battle was relentless. The creatures moved with unnatural speed, their glowing eyes fixed on Torian as they struck again and again. The fire within him flared with each attack, the dagger glowing brighter. But the energy was chaotic, pulling at him in different directions. He stumbled, his chest heaving. The whispers in the wind grew louder, sharper, drowning out his thoughts. He closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythm of the elements. The fire steadied, the earth grounded him, and the wind carried his movements. Together, they pushed back the chaos. Torian opened his eyes, his grip on the dagger tightening. He stepped into the next attack, the blade slicing cleanly through the shadow's core. The creature dissolved into the air, its presence fading. Skarn finished the last of the creatures with a powerful strike, its roar echoing through the valley. The silence that followed was deafening. Torian dropped to his knees, his breath ragged. The dagger slipped from his hand, its glow fading. Skarn limped toward him, its golden eyes scanning the shadows for any remaining threats. "We're still here," Torian said softly, his voice trembling. He rested a hand on the beast's shoulder, his fingers brushing its iron-like hide. "That has to count for something." The shadows around them shifted, the ground beneath them trembling faintly. Torian stood slowly, his chest tightening as the whispers returned, stronger now, more insistent. The energy within the cracks in the earth pulsed brighter, casting an eerie glow across the valley. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form wreathed in shadow. It was taller than the creatures Torian had faced, its presence commanding and unyielding. Its eyes burned with a cold, piercing light, and its voice was low and resonant. "You carry the light of the elements, but it will not save you here." Torian's chest tightened as he raised his dagger, the energy within him flaring weakly. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "What do you want?" The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "I am what lies beyond the balance you cling to, the shadow that waits for those who falter." It raised a hand, the darkness around it surging. "Will you fall, Torian, or will you rise?" The ground beneath him cracked, the energy pulsing brighter. Torian steadied himself, his gaze unwavering. The fire, earth, and wind surged within him, their strength growing stronger as they pushed back against the shadow. "I won't fall," he said, his voice firm. "Not here. Not now." The figure tilted its head, its burning eyes narrowing. "Then prove it." The shadows erupted, surging toward Torian and Skarn like a wave. The valley trembled as the battle began, the light of the elements clashing with the encroaching darkness. Torian stepped forward, his dagger blazing with light. He felt the fire, earth, and wind move through him, each one guiding his steps, his strikes. The battle was fierce, the shadows unrelenting, but Torian's resolve burned brighter than ever. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for the balance he had forged, the bond he had created with the elements and with himself. Chapter 22. The shadows grasped the shadows surged toward Torian and Skarn like an unrelenting tide, their forms shifting and writhing with an unnatural fluidity. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the energy from the cracks pulsing brighter with each passing moment. Torian's dagger flared to life, its glow cutting through the darkness, but the sheer magnitude of the force before him sent a chill through his veins. Skarn stood firm at his side, its golden eyes blazing with defiance. The beast growled low, its claws digging into the trembling earth as it prepared to strike. Torian steadied his breathing, the fire, earth, and wind within him pulsing in unison. The elements responded to the encroaching threat, their energy surging with a quiet power. "This is different," Torian muttered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the shadows. "Stronger." Skarn huffed in agreement, its growl deepening as the first wave of shadows lunged forward. The battle erupted in a cacophony of light and darkness. Torian moved instinctively, the wind carrying his steps as he dodged the sweeping claws of the shadowed figures. His dagger sliced through the air, its blade glowing with the fire that surged within him. Each strike sent bursts of light rippling through the shadows, momentarily pushing them back. But for every shadow he struck down, more surged forward. Their glowing eyes burned with cold malice, their movements growing faster and more coordinated. Torian gritted his teeth, the energy within him flaring as he focused on the earth's grounding strength. His strikes became deliberate, each one precise and controlled. Skarn roared, leaping at the nearest shadow. The beast's claws raked through its form, scattering it into fragments of darkness. Another shadow lunged from the side, but Skarn spun quickly, its massive jaws snapping shut on the creature. The beast fought with a ferocity Torian had never seen, its movements sharp and unyielding. Despite their efforts, the shadows began to close in. The ground beneath them trembled violently, the cracks widening as the dark energy within them pulsed brighter. Torian stumbled, his dagger slipping from his grasp as the tremors knocked him off balance. The shadows seized the moment, surging toward him with terrifying speed. Skarn roared, placing itself between Torian and the advancing darkness. The beast struck again and again, its claws tearing through the shadows, but it was outnumbered. One of the shadowed figures struck Skarn hard, sending the beast tumbling to the ground. "No!" Torian shouted, his voice breaking. He scrambled to his feet, the fire within him flaring wildly. The energy surged, chaotic and uncontrolled, as he reached for the dagger. Before he could grasp it, the shadows struck, their forms coiling around him like living chains. The cold seeped into his skin, pulling at the fire, earth, and wind within him. Torian gasped, his strength faltering as the darkness tightened its grip. The voice of the shadowed figure from before echoed through the valley, cold and resonant. "You carry the light of the elements, but it wavers. The balance you claim is fragile. easily broken. Torian struggled against the shadows, his breath shallow. The energy within him flickered, the fire dimming, the earth trembling and the wind stilling. The darkness pressed harder, threatening to snuff out the fragile harmony he had fought so hard to build. The voice continued, sharper now. Will you fall? Will you let the shadows consume you? Torian clenched his fists, his mind racing. He thought of his father's last stand, of the village reduced to ash. He thought of the trials he had faced, the moments where the elements had pushed him to his limits. And he thought of Skarn, the beast who had fought beside him through it all. No, he whispered, his voice trembling. I won't fall. The energy within him surged, brighter and stronger than before. The fire blazed to life, burning hotter and steadier. The earth steadied him, its strength grounding him against the pull of the shadows. The wind roared, carrying his thoughts forward with a clarity that cut through the darkness. Torian opened his eyes, the dagger in his hand blazing with light. The shadows recoiled, their grip faltering as the fire, earth, and wind wove together into a single, harmonious force. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, the energy within him guiding each strike. The first shadow shattered under his blade, its form dissolving into the air. The others followed, each one falling to the light as Torian pressed forward. The darkness around him faltered, the glowing cracks in the ground dimming as the shadows retreated. When the final shadow fell, the valley grew still. Torian stood in the silence, his chest heaving. The dagger's glow faded, its warmth steady in his hand. Skarn limped toward him, its golden eyes watching him closely. You okay? Torian asked softly, kneeling beside the beast. Skarn huffed, its growl softer now, and nudged his arm. Torian smiled faintly, resting a hand on its shoulder. Yeah, me too. The ground beneath them shifted, the cracks closing as the dark energy faded. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight of the shadows lifting. Torian stood slowly, his legs trembling but steady. The shadowed figure reappeared, its form flickering faintly. Its voice was quieter now, almost contemplative. You have faced the darkness within yourself and beyond. The balance you carry is stronger than I believed. Torian's jaw tightened as he stepped forward, his gaze steady. Then let me pass, he said firmly. I've proven myself. The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. You have. But the balance you hold is not the end. It is only the beginning. The path ahead will test not just your strength but your heart. Are you prepared to facete? Torian nodded, his grip on the dagger tightening. I am. The figure dissolved into the air, its presence fading. The valley shifted, the jagged cliffs giving way to a narrow path that wound upward, disappearing into the light. Torian turned to Skarn, his resolve hardening. Let's keep moving, he said softly. The beast huffed in agreement, falling into step beside him. Together, they stepped onto the path, the horizon calling them forward. Chapter 23. The echoing labyrinth of barren plains stretched out endlessly before them, a silent expanse of reflective black stone that seemed to drink in the light. Torian crouched at its edge, his gloved hand brushing against the ground. The smooth surface rippled faintly beneath his touch, as though it were alive. Beyond this lifeless stretch, the labyrinth rose, a massive, shifting monument of glowing walls and arches that seemed to pulse in time with an unseen heartbeat. It towered against the horizon, an impossible structure that shimmered as though it were both real and a mirage. Skarn stood beside him, its iron-like body tense, the golden fire of its eyes scanning the horizon. The beast's claws tapped against the stone uneasily, sending faint echoes through the stillness. This place is wrong, Torian murmured, standing and gripping the hilt of his blade. The veins of fiery energy running along the weapon flickered faintly, almost in response to the labyrinth's glow. He felt the ember in his chest pulse, a reassuring warmth against the oppressive silence. Skarn growled low in agreement. Its ears twitched as if catching sounds Torian could not hear. Before them, The labyrinth seemed to shift and breathe, its walls undulating like living flesh. Each archway leading into its depths bore runes that glowed faintly, their shapes changing if looked at too long. The whispers began as soon as they approached, faint voices weaving through the air. "We have to go through," Torian said, steeling himself. His eyes met Skarn's, and the beast gave a small rumble, a sound that might have been resigned agreement. "I can feel it. The labyrinth. It's pulling me." The ember within his chest flared slightly, a tugging sensation drawing him toward the central archway. Its runes burned a deep red, and as Torian stepped closer, the ground beneath his feet began to hum faintly. The moment they crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The maze's grip the air grew dense and cold, the oppressive weight of the labyrinth settling over them like a suffocating blanket. The entryway vanished, leaving nothing but endless, glowing walls of a faintly pulsing material that resembled liquid stone. The hum of energy resonated louder now, echoing in time with the ember in Torian's chest. Ahead of them, the path split into 3 directions. Each corridor pulsed with a different hue: red, green, and blue. The glowing runes on the walls seemed to move, forming strange symbols that melted away if Torian tried to focus on them. I don't like this," he muttered. His voice sounded small, almost swallowed by the labyrinth's energy. He felt the ember pulse again, tugging toward the red path. He trusted it, even though the air down that corridor seemed hotter and heavier. He glanced at Skarn. "Red," he said simply. The beast growled softly, falling into step behind him as they moved deeper into the labyrinth. The first trial. Flame-bound spirits, the walls narrowed as they walked, the oppressive heat intensifying with each step. The glowing red veins along the walls began to flicker faster, casting strange, shifting shadows. Torian tightened his grip on his blade, its fiery veins glowing faintly in response to the ember's energy. Without warning, the ground trembled. A burst of heat radiated from the walls, and spectral figures emerged, their bodies translucent and wreathed in flickering red flames. They had no discernible faces, only burning eyes that bore into Torian with unnatural malice. Torian's blade flared as he readied himself, the warmth of the embers steadying him. "Looks like we're not getting through without a fight." One of the spirits lunged, its flaming blade cutting through the air with a sound like a hissing furnace. Torian sidestepped the attack and countered with a powerful swing, his blade cutting through the spirit's form. It let out a high-pitched shriek before dissolving into ash. Skarn roared, leaping at another spirit with claws that glinted like steel. The beast swiped through its foe with a single strike, the flame-bound figure bursting into a cloud of embers. More came, their movements unerringly fast and coordinated. Torian dodged and struck with precision, the fiery veins along his blade burning brighter with each attack. Sweat dripped down his brow, the heat of the battle pressing against him like a physical weight. He noticed a pattern as the spirits attacked. They seemed drawn to the energy of the ember, their strikes focusing on his chest as though they could sense its presence. Using this to his advantage, he baited their movements, allowing Skarn to flank and tear through their ranks with devastating efficiency. The battle ended as abruptly as it began. The last spirit dissolved into ash, and the walls of the labyrinth shifted, the red glow fading as a new path opened ahead. "Not bad," Torian said, catching his breath. He placed a hand on Skarn's head, the beast's rumble of approval a welcome sound in the tense silence. "But I don't think that's the last of it." The second trial, Reflections, the next chamber, was different. Mirrors lined the walls, their surfaces warped and shifting. Torian's reflection stared back at him, but it was wrong, distorted, with eyes that glowed faintly with malice. He felt the ember in his chest falter, as though something in the room was trying to suppress its light. One by one, the reflections stepped out of the mirrors, solidifying into shadowy doppelgangers of Torian and Skarn. Their movements were fluid and deliberate, their weapons identical to Torian's. The first doppelganger struck without warning, its blade flashing with dark energy. Torian parried instinctively, the clash sending a shockwave through the chamber. The reflection's movements were perfect mirrors of his own, making each strike and counter feel like fighting himself. "This is different," Torian muttered, gritting his teeth as he deflected another blow. The doppelganger's attacks were relentless, each one calculated to exploit his weaknesses. Skarn roared, facing off against its shadowy counterpart. The two beasts clashed violently, their claws raking against each other with a ferocity that sent sparks flying. Torian realized brute strength wouldn't win this fight. Focusing inward, he drew on the balance of fire, shadow, and light within him. The ember pulsed, its energy merging with the fiery veins of his blade. With a powerful strike, he unleashed a surge of light that disrupted the shadowy form of his doppelganger. The reflection faltered, its form flickering as Torian's strikes became faster and more precise. With a final blow, he shattered it, its dark energy dissipating into the air. Skarn, emboldened by Torian's success, overpowered its double with a ferocious swipe, the shadowy beast dissolving into nothingness. As the last reflection faded, the mirrors along the walls cracked, their surfaces shattering into shards that rained down onto the floor. The labyrinth shifted again, revealing a glowing doorway at the far end of the chamber. The core of the final chamber was vast, its walls lined with runes that pulsed in unison with the beating of Torian's heart. At the center hovered a massive orb of light and shadow, its energy radiating in waves that made the air ripple. Torian stepped forward, his blade ready, as a figure emerged from the orb. The figure was humanoid but composed of swirling light and shadow, its voice deep and resonant. "You have traversed a labyrinth and faced its trials. But to claim its power, you must prove yourself one final time." The final fight was unlike anything Torian had faced. The figure moved with incredible speed, its strikes forcing him to draw on every ounce of the ember's energy. Skarn fought valiantly beside him, its claws tearing through waves of energy that the figure unleashed. With a final surge of power, Torian leaped toward the figure, his blade cutting through its core. The orb shattered, its light engulfing the chamber as the labyrinth's energy dissolved into the air. Torian felt the shard of light settle into his hand, its warmth merging with the ember in his chest. The labyrinth shifted one final time, opening a path to the surface. "We're almost there," he said softly to Skarn. "One step closer." Chapter 24. The Valley of Ascension, the labyrinth's oppressive walls vanished behind them as Torian and Skarn emerged into a windswept valley that stretched toward the horizon. The ground shimmered faintly underfoot, as if imbued with a hidden energy, and the air seemed alive, vibrating with a soft hum that resonated in Torian's chest. Columns of light rose from the earth at irregular intervals, each one glowing with a distinct hue, gold, silver, and crimson. They reached into the sky, like beacons marking a path toward the towering mountain in the distance. Skarn paused, its iron-like body tense, as it scanned the valley with its golden eyes. The beast's claws scraped lightly against the ground, sending faint echoes through the strange stillness. Torian exhaled slowly, gripping the hilt of his blade as he took in the valley. "This place feels ancient," he murmured. The ember within his chest pulsed faintly, responding to the hum that filled the air. "Like it's been waiting." Skarn growled softly, its gaze fixed on the distant mountain. The beast shifted its weight, a low rumble vibrating through its chest. "We're close," Torian said, placing a hand on Skarn's shoulder. "I can feel it." The first column, the ethereal guardians as they moved through the valley, the humming grew louder, resonating deep in Torian's bones. The first column of light stood tall before them, glowing gold. The energy it radiated was warm and soothing, but as they approached, the hum shifted, becoming sharper and more insistent. The ground trembled slightly, and from the base of the column emerged figures, beings made entirely of golden light, the ethereal guardians. Each one carried a spear that shimmered as though it were forged from liquid fire. Their movements were fluid and deliberate, their glowing eyes fixed on Torian and Skarn. "You who seek the mountain," one of the guardians said, its voice resonating like a song. "Must prove your balance. Fire alone cannot burn through the storm." Torian's grip on his blade tightened. Guess there's no way around this. The first guardian moved with startling speed, its spear flashing toward Torian in a blur of light. He parried instinctively, the clash of their weapons sending sparks flying. The impact reverberated through his arms, and he staggered slightly as the hum of the valley grew louder. Another guardian lunged, its movements synchronized with the first. Torian ducked, swinging his blade in a wide arc that struck the second figure. The fiery veins along his weapon flared, cutting through the light with a burst of energy. The guardian dissolved into a stream of golden particles, which flowed back into the column. Skarn roared, leaping at the remaining guardians with claws bared. The beast's strikes were powerful, each swipe scattering the figures into shimmering fragments. But for every guardian they destroyed, more emerged from the column, their forms unrelenting. "They're testing us," Torian realized, his voice strained as he blocked another strike. "Not just our strength, our focus." Closing his eyes, he let the ember's energy flow through him, merging with the light and shadow that had carried him through the labyrinth. His blade burned brighter, its fiery veins now streaked with gold. Each swing became more precise, each movement a deliberate response to the guardian's attacks. The balance was key. Fire, shadow, and light moving as one. The battle ended as abruptly as it began. The last guardian dissolved, and the column of light flared brightly before fading into the earth. The hum softened, and the valley grew still. "We're doing this," Torian said, breathing heavily. He placed a hand on Skarn's head, the beast letting out a soft rumble of approval. One step at a time. The silver column. The storm, the second column, was different. Its light was cold and sharp, and the air around it crackled with energy. As they approached, dark clouds began to gather above the valley, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of ozone. Lightning arced from the column's surface, striking the ground in bursts that made the earth tremble. Torian felt the ember within him flare, its warmth struggling against the cold energy of the storm. Skarn growled, its body low to the ground as it braced against the wind. The beast's golden eyes flicked to Torian, and he nodded, stepping closer to the column. The storm struck without warning. A massive bolt of lightning shot toward them, forcing Torian to raise his blade instinctively. The fiery veins along its surface absorbed the energy, glowing brighter as the bolt dissipated. But the storm didn't relent. Lightning rained down in chaotic bursts, each strike forcing Torian and Skarn to move quickly to avoid being overwhelmed. "Focus!" Torian shouted over the howling wind. The ember in his chest pulsed, its warmth steadying him as he channeled its energy into his blade. He swung upward, the fiery light cutting through a bolt of lightning and dispersing it into harmless sparks. The storm seemed to respond, its strikes growing more intense. Skarn roared, leaping into the chaos with claws extended. The beast's powerful limbs deflected bolts of energy, its movements a blur as it danced through the storm. Torian closed his eyes, focusing on the balance within him. The ember, the black orb, and the shard from the labyrinth pulsed together, their energies merging. He raised his blade high, the fiery veins flaring with a radiant light that pierced through the storm. With a final swing, he unleashed a wave of energy that collided with the column. The storm screamed as the column shattered, its light fading into the earth. The valley grew quiet again, the air heavy with the remnants of the storm. Torian lowered his blade, his chest heaving. Skarn limped to his side, its golden eyes gleaming with pride. "We're stronger together," Torian said softly, placing a hand on the beast's head. "We've proven that." The crimson column. The final trial, the third and final column, was crimson, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. The air around it was heavy and oppressive, each step toward it feeling like walking through water. Torian's blade glowed faintly, the fiery veins dimming as if the column's energy sought to suppress its light. As they approached, the ground beneath them shifted, forming a circular arena. The column rose into the air, its light coalescing into a figure that hovered above the arena. The figure was humanoid, but its form was blurred, as though it were only partially present. Its voice echoed through the valley, low and resonant. "You have proven your strength and your resolve," it said. "But to ascend, you must face yourself." Torian froze as the figure descended, its blurred form solidifying into a perfect replica of him. The doppelganger raised a blade identical to his own, its fiery veins glowing with a malevolent light. The final trial. The doppelganger moved first, its blade striking with terrifying speed. Torian barely blocked the blow, the force of the impact sending him stumbling back. The reflection's movements were unerringly precise, each strike calculated to exploit his weaknesses. Skarn lunged at the doppelganger, but the reflection was faster. It turned within human speed, striking the beast with a wave of energy that sent it skidding across the arena. Torian gritted his teeth, his strikes growing more deliberate as he matched the reflection's rhythm. Each clash of their blades sent shockwaves through the arena, the fiery veins of their weapons blazing brightly. The balance within him wavered as the doppelganger's attacks grew more relentless. The ember pulsed, its warmth struggling against the reflection's dark energy. But Torian refused to give in. "This is who I am," he said, his voice steady. "Fire, shadow, and light." The ember flared, its energy merging fully with the shard and the black orb. Torian's blade burned with a radiant light, the fiery veins blazing as he unleashed a final strike. The reflection faltered, its form flickering before dissolving into the air. The crimson column shattered, its energy flooding into the valley. Torian collapsed to one knee, his chest heaving as the oppressive weight lifted. Skarn limped over to him, its golden eyes meeting his. Torian placed a hand on the beast's head, drawing strength from its unwavering presence. "We're ready," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "The peak is next." As they turned toward the towering mountain in the distance, the valley hummed softly, its light guiding their path. The final ascent awaited. Chapter 25. The final trial, the Valley of Ascension, faded behind them as Torian and Skarn approached the base of the towering mountain. Its jagged peak disappeared into the clouds, shrouded in mist and shadow. The air was colder here, and the ground beneath their feet was covered in frost that crunched softly with each step. The faint hum of energy that had guided them through the valley grew quieter, replaced by the rhythmic pulse of something ancient and alive. Skarn growled softly, its golden eyes scanning the rocky terrain. The beast's body was tense, its claws scraping against the frozen ground. Torian felt the ember in his chest flare, its warmth a steady reassurance against the chill that seemed to seep into his bones. "This is it," Torian said, his voice barely above a whisper. He tightened his grip on his blade, its fiery veins glowing faintly. The final climb. The mountain loomed above them, its presence oppressive and unyielding. The path ahead was narrow and steep, winding upward in sharp switchbacks that clung precariously to the rock face. The air grew thinner with every step, the cold biting at Torian's skin despite the ember's warmth. The first ascent. The winds of judgment, the wind howled as they climbed higher, its icy fingers tearing at Torian's cloak and whipping his hair into his face. Skarn pressed close to the mountainside, its powerful limbs gripping the rock as it moved steadily upward. The path narrowed further, the edge dropping away into a dizzying abyss. Torian paused, catching his breath as he shielded his face from the wind. The ember pulsed faintly, its energy steady but subdued. "The mountain's testing us," he muttered, his voice carried away by the gale. As if in response, the wind grew stronger, swirling around them in a chaotic vortex. The air shimmered, and from the mist emerged translucent figures, their forms wreathed in a spectral light. Their faces were obscured, but their eyes burned with an intense, judgmental glow. "The Guardians of the Peak," Torian said, his breath visible in the frigid air. The figures raised their arms, the wind swirling into solid, jagged spears of ice that hurtled toward Torian and Skarn. Torian moved instinctively, his blade flashing as he deflected the first spear. The fiery veins along its surface flared, melting the ice into harmless steam. Skarn roared, leaping at one of the spectral figures with claws bared. The beast's powerful strike dispersed the figure, its form shattering into a flurry of snowflakes. But the remaining guardians advanced, their attacks growing more relentless. Torian gritted his teeth, focusing on the ember's warmth as he parried another spear. The balance within him, fire, shadow, and light, pulsed in harmony, steadying his movements. He swung his blade in a wide arc, the fiery energy cutting through two more figures in a burst of light. "They're testing our resolve," Torian realized, his voice firm. "We have to prove we belong here." And the storm that awaited him was only